The gospel lesson for the 16th Sunday after Pentecost is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 to 37. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. And then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Heaven and earth will pass away, but the word of the Lord is forever. Thanks be to God. Okay, so let's start by asking, why was Jesus in Tyre? Well, last week Susan preached on the first part of Mark 7. Jesus had done some amazing things reported in Mark 6. He fed 5,000 men, walked on water, and after landing at Gennesaret, he healed many people. Of course, the scribes and Pharisees couldn't stand for that sort of thing, so they came and challenged him. The first half of this chapter describes Jesus sparring with his fellow Jews about what is proper behavior in God's eyes. They argued about ritual purity and interpretations of Mosaic law. One of the students who attends Sacred Paths, which is our campus ministry, commented that she gets the most criticism from other Christians. In fact, just the fact that she attends our campus ministry as well as others must mean that she has ideas that are wrong in the eyes of those other ministries. And of course, in many Christian traditions, certainty and having the right answers and right beliefs are essential to a salvation. They are right and we are wrong, of course. And if you argue about certain doctrines, they'll either appeal to the authority of some man like the Pope, or they'll cite some scripture that they think settles everything. This kind of argument is tiring. We are all children of God, all trying to do our best to understand God's will in our lives. Some beliefs may be more or less life-giving, but it's hard to say who's right and who's wrong. The stressful nature of discussing matters that are so close to the heart is probably why there's a taboo about discussing religion in polite company. The self-righteous nature of those who think they have exclusive access to the truth, with a capital T, shuts down a healthy exploration of faith that allows for different perspectives and different ways of following God. Jesus was embroiled in these arguments, had enough, and decided to escape to Tyre for a little break. He probably figured that the scribes and Pharisees wouldn't chase him that far. Tyre is a good distance from Gennesaret, about 35 miles, probably 2 or 3 days' journey. And Gennesaret is already a good distance from Jerusalem, about 80 miles. So Jesus could perhaps count on some downtime where he didn't have to spar with other Jews about the interpretation of written and oral law. Tyre was an old and prosperous city. It was the main source of Tyrian purple. which is an extremely valuable dye that they started producing about 1200 BC. Tyrian purple is extracted from the mucus produced by the murex family of sea snails. Its production is difficult and time-consuming, and so the dye was literally worth its weight in gold. It was a leading commodity of the Phoenicians and was exported around the Mediterranean, and because of its expense, it became associated with royalty. In the Roman era, Tyre began producing another valuable commodity called garum, which was a sauce created by fermenting fish innards. One source I read compared garum to caviar because it was so highly prized. The fact that Tyre produced these two commodities by processing fish and sea snails probably made the whole city smell bad, but also made it an extremely wealthy city. On top of these industries, Tyre was also a major port that connected the Mediterranean to the Silk Road in East Asia. Tyrian shekels were almost pure silver, and so that's what Jews had to use to pay the temple tax. So when you hear that Jesus went away to Tyre, maybe it was like going to, I don't know, Silicon Valley or some city on the Riviera, you know, a wealthy city. And sure, there's poor people in Silicon Valley, just like there's poor people everywhere. But you might expect the random person you encounter to be relatively well off. The story of Jesus' encounter with the Syrophoenician woman doesn't look very good at first. A woman comes to Jesus asking for what he has already done so many times before, just to heal her daughter. And does he do it? No, at least not at first. He compares her to a dog and seems ready to send her away. Now, I've read a lot of different perspectives on this story, and the one that makes the most sense to me is that Jesus was implicitly criticizing the wealth of Tyre. As a wealthy commercial center, its residents would have naturally felt superior to a Galilean country bumpkin. So Jesus is essentially saying, you have all this wealth that you've extracted from people like me. Let my people at least have these gifts from God to themselves. Use your wealth to take care of your daughter, and I will share God's grace with those who have nothing. In response, the woman asks for the crumbs from God's table. We've already seen a chapter earlier that when Jesus feeds the multitude, the crumbs fill a dozen baskets. Shortly after this story, Jesus feeds another multitude, and the crumbs fill 7 baskets. God's providence is so abundant that no matter how much is showered upon the lost sheep of Israel, there will always be more left for the Gentiles. So here we have this contrast between the people to whom Jesus was sent and the people who were outside the covenant that God had made with Abraham. The covenant established an eternal relationship between God and Israel, in which God would shower blessings upon Israel in return for their love of both God and neighbor. The story of Abraham actually has 2 covenants within it. The first one of unconditional love and grace from God to humanity, and then a second one that is conditional. My interpretation of this is that God's unconditional love and grace are always available to us, but that the conditions of the law guide us as we strive to build a society that lives as God's kingdom now. The scribes and Pharisees in Jesus' time, as well as many Christians today, put the emphasis on the conditions. You must earn your place in God's kingdom by following these nitpicky rules as interpreted by someone in authority. Only those who embrace the church's rules are worthy of a place in the earthly expression of God's kingdom. But they forget that the rules are built on top of the unconditional love and grace of the original covenant. They forget that no human can limit God. The Syrophoenician woman, though, focused on what actually matters. She loved her daughter. No amount of wealth or social privilege could heal her daughter. She may have thought that this country bumpkin from Galilee was beneath her station and not worthy of her attention, just as Jews thought that Gentiles were outside the covenant and not worthy of approaching God in the temple. But one thing was more powerful than any hierarchy of wealth, culture, or ethnicity: love. Her love of her daughter drove her to seek any solution, no matter the cost to her dignity. I'm reminded of the time Rhonda was fighting her facial pain. Now, we have very good health insurance, and I wouldn't say that I'm wealthy, but I have more resources and flexibility than a lot of people. And we visited numerous doctors in St. Louis, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, but at the end of the day, none of it mattered. Money can't buy a cure. The only way we were able to get her pain under control was by working with one doctor over a period of nearly 2 years to find the solution together. My love for her kept me searching for a solution, and our relationship with her neurologist enabled us to find the solution together. In the same way, the woman's wealth did not enable her to cure her daughter. Her wealth did not make her worthy to enter Jesus' presence. Yet her ethnicity did not make her unworthy either. The disciples may have thought that she had no place asking Jesus for help, but she was bold to ask anyway. Have you ever been made to feel unworthy of God? Maybe you were too young or too old, or of the wrong social status, or had said or done something outside the norm or contrary to doctrine, or you weren't dressed properly, like we read in the Epistle of James. People have a way of making outsiders feel uncomfortable and unworthy, and church members are sinful people, right? We try our best, but sometimes we can't help but allow our cultural attitudes to overwhelm our calling as Christians. Perhaps this woman felt the same way. She went to a house full of Galilean Jews, probably mostly men, and felt excluded because of her gender and ethnicity. And yet, she persisted. She knew that none of it mattered. It didn't matter that she was a Gentile. It didn't matter what her wealth or social status were. It didn't matter if she was ritually unclean. All that mattered was that she loved her daughter, and Jesus could heal her. She needed God's grace in her life, and nothing would prevent her from seeking it. Jesus first reminded her of her status, perhaps as a social critique. Perhaps he knew how his disciples would react if he left their fellowship to care for the child of a wealthy foreigner. She could have responded by demanding that Jesus do her bidding, as she had probably done before to many other men she considered beneath her. She could have responded by promising him wealth or power, just as Satan tempted Jesus after his baptism. Yet she knew that Jesus was no ordinary man able to be bribed or cajoled. The sacrifice that God desires is a contrite heart. The woman knew she needed God's grace and that nothing she could do would make her worthy of Jesus' service. But Jesus' ultimate response reminds us that nothing she could do would make her unworthy either. She was in need, and God's abundant grace overflowed onto her. In the same way, no matter how worthy or unworthy you feel, you may be bold to approach God with your needs. God cannot be cajoled or bribed. God cannot be argued into doing your will. But if you approach God with a contrite heart, as the Syrophoenician woman did, God's grace will flow over and through you. Even the crumbs of God's blessings are abundant and life-giving. You too may be wealthy or poor, an insider or an outsider, a person of high standing in the community, or one of the lowly and forgotten. None of that matters. All of us stand in need of prayer. All of us need God's grace in our lives, unearned and unearnable, a free gift through Christ. All of us need healing in our bodies, minds, and souls. All of us need to be connected to the infinite love of God that transcends the pains and struggles of this world. And all of us may be bold to approach God through Christ, who came to demonstrate that God's love is for everyone. Amen.